For more on what's happening with oil and its recent losing streak, Kim Iskyan is live for us in Singapore, an investment analyst and also managing director of Truewealth Publishing. Good to see you, Kim. A lot of people are calling the bottom for oil. Are we there yet?
All right, Phil. Phil, I think we're probably within 20% of the bottom. I think a year from now we'll look back and see that this was pretty much close to the bottom. What's happening is that what OPEC's trying to do, it's trying to drown everybody else out. It's just maintaining production. It's not cutting production. And eventually we're going to see a continued decline in U.S. oil production, and that will ultimately affect the price and provide a floor.
People forget the purpose of OPEC.
So I think we are closer to the bottom than we are to the top.
People forget the purpose of OPEC was to sort of set limits on production that would ultimately impact sort of long-term price trends that the group of OPEC nations want. This latest meeting, everything that I've been reading has basically called OPEC essentially impotent. They couldn't control the production, which means they can't control the prices. And now we have all this oversupply and no one's being disciplined and the prices keep dropping. Is OPEC still relevant?
I don't think OPEC is even relevant anymore. They've essentially said it's every man and woman for himself and herself, and everyone just produce as much as you want, and we're going to try to maintain market share and come what may. So I think that even speaking of OPEC as a cartel is increasingly irrelevant and outdated. So no, I don't think it's really relevant anymore.
We have another interesting trifecta. You've got the producers in the U.S. and the drillers. You've got Russia. Then you have the rest of the OPEC countries sprinkled around the world, mostly in the Middle East. And everyone's playing a game of chicken, right? I'm going to keep making oil, and I hope that you stop making oil because it's gotten so cheap now. And what's going to happen is they're all going to go bankrupt at this rate because nobody is going to be able to profitably produce oil when oil gets into their teens, which is much less than where it is now. I mean, you already have people worried about U.S. oil companies along with the rest of the world's oil companies. Is this a game of chicken, and how does it end?
I think the way it ends, Phil, is that we're going to see a lot of U.S. Domestic shale producers go bust. That's going to really pressure the debt markets. That's, I think, an underappreciated dimension of this. But we have seen for the past 10 months already declining production in the U.S. That's going to accelerate. I think we're going to see, unfortunately, on the other side, we're going to see rising production, or we're going to see exports from Iran. And I think it is going to come to a tipping point, at which point we see some companies going bust. We see an emergency OPEC meeting. Perhaps OPEC does come and say, look, this can't go on. And then we do eventually, that will mark the bottom. Then we'll see a recovery, and eventually these things tend to balance themselves out. Fortunately, that's the beauty of markets.
Saudi Arabia is getting a little blame here because a lot of people expected them perhaps to soften their stance in terms of production, and they haven't. So if Saudi Arabia is not going to do anything, price is going to keep going down. And they've already come out and said that, hey, we don't have enough money to fund our entire government, so we've got to go borrow money against that. At some point, what is Saudi Arabia thinking?
I think Saudi Arabia it's at this point, it's thinking only in the short term. And I think that at a certain point, cooler heads do prevail. At a certain point, people do look at the numbers, they look at the fiscal situation, and they do pull back a little bit. And if Saudi Arabia doesn't, then somebody else cries uncle first. And eventually, things do come back into equilibrium. And Phil, I would point out that while this is all bad for oil producers, oil-producing countries, oil-producing companies, it's actually fantastic for the rest of the world. It's been a fillip to growth. It's also helped bring inflation down to a lot of countries. So things are bad for oil producers, but for everybody else, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I just heard from our cameraman Ray here. He said gas was $1.87 a gallon. We haven't heard those numbers. I don't even know when the last time we heard those numbers. Let me ask you about this recent climate change talks that was going on in Paris. The irony of it happening at the same time when prices are going down, and they're talking about eliminating the use of fossil fuels or steeply curbing it. How much of an impact might that have going into 2016?
I don't think there's much short to medium term impact of that, but I think that we're approaching over the next few years a tipping point, and big oil is going to be replaced by big solar, and big oil is going the way of tobacco. I think at some point our children will be talking about those days when you could produce oil and it wasn't overregulated, it wasn't taxed to oblivion, which is the direction that it's going. So I don't think that had any short-term impact, but I think that we are approaching the point where oil is really on a long-term downtrend, and it's going to go out over the next generation or two.
All right, but now hang on. If you were a betting man and you wanted to buy oil, at what price point would you start looking to buy oil?
Yeah, I'd be looking to start buying oil in the high 20s. I think that that's going to be within 20% of where we are now, 20, a little bit more, 20 and change. I think that's where I would go. And I would in particular be looking at those producers that are in countries that have just a triple whammy or double whammy of currency depreciation, of all sorts of political issues. For example, Russia. There are some low-cost producers that are on a valuation basis extremely cheap, like Lukoil. That's where I would be looking to really have the sharp bounce back that I think is eventually coming.